So we're going to start our second panel discussion now. We've had a bit of a change of schedule, but we'll start our second panel discussion now on the emerging world and poverty. So you've heard from the first panel some great new ideas on development, and for this panel we kind of focus a bit more on the empirics of developing countries, of where they are at the moment, the challenges they're facing, and how to go forward. So I'm joined by two very distinguished academics to discuss this panel debate with us. We will, as for the last panel, open up to questions from the floor after we've heard from both speakers. But without further ado, let me just first introduce our first speaker of the day, of this panel, Professor Ajit Singh, who is Emeritus Professor here of Economics at the University of Cambridge, and also Life Fellow of Queen's College. And he's joined today by his partner, Anne Zamit, as well. So Professor Singh has published, nearly 200 research papers, including ones in top economic journals, and his research spans across many areas, under which is industrialization, economic development, and economic policy in emerging countries. He's been senior economic advisor to the governments of Mexico and Tanzania, and he's been a consultant to several UN development organizations, including the World Bank and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So all of that, and I believe he continues to teach in the MPhil Development Studies course here as well. So, and this afternoon, Professor Singh will talk about the development of today's middle-income countries and some of the challenges that they are facing. So I'll hand over to Professor Singh now.
Thank you very much indeed. May I start with apologies for my Parkinson's disease, which keeps my voice low. The technical people have made the adjustments necessary to make me audible, for which I'm very grateful. Also, now and then, I make involuntary movements of limbs. Please ignore these and regard them as personal idiosyncrasies. I'll be reading my speech, and there'll be PowerPoint slides to go alongside the text. This presentation briefly comments on the following issues. First, it outlines the present extraordinary state of the world economy, which departs much from the previous historical experience. This refers specifically to the factual observation that developing countries have grown at a much faster rate than the developed countries since at least the beginning of the new millennium. Secondly, the paper will comment on the lessons to be drawn from the experience of Korea, the most successful industrialization story in the history of mankind. Thirdly, the role of the government and of privately owned large firms in the Korean economy will be scrutinized. Fourthly, the mechanics of knowledge sharing between developing countries will be analyzed. Fifthly, the role of trade unions, labor, and the struggle for democracy in the evolution of South Korea's economy and polity will be examined. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living through extraordinary times. During the first 12 years of the new millennium, an unusual event has taken place. Developing countries have expanded at a much faster rate than developed countries. 5 developed countries, US, UK, France, Germany, and Japan, achieved an average annual growth rate of only 1.5% between 2000 and 2012. This compares with the corresponding growth rate of 5 emerging countries, India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, of nearly 6% per annum. India and China, the two most populous countries, have done particularly well. India achieved average annual growth rate of over 7% in the first 12 years of the new millennium, while the corresponding growth rate of the United States was a third of that number. China similarly had a stellar growth performance. Other non-BRIC countries, such as Colombia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, have also performed much better than the rich countries. Indeed, on the basis of this data, one might argue the so-called global crisis has affected only the advanced countries, while the leading developing economy countries have enjoyed a great leap forward rather than crisis during the first decade of the new millennium. Excellent performance of developing countries is one of the most encouraging features of the current crisis. It is not only desirable in itself, but their fast growth also helps the world economy. The superior performance of developing countries, as in the current crisis, is a new departure. Not too long ago, it used to be an article of faith among scholars that in a global economic and financial crisis, it is the periphery countries which suffer a prolonged slowdown or worse, while the center takes care of itself. The story in the present crisis seems to be quite the opposite. Why should this be so? And can this performance be sustained? Here there are conflicting voices from unexpected quarters. The IMF suggests that the improvement in the position of the periphery countries during this crisis is their growing ability over the past 2 decades to absorb shocks. The IMF observed, and I quote them, developing countries' improved performance is explained by both good policies and lower incidence of external and domestic shocks. On the other hand, Yilmaz Akils, chief economist of the South Center in Geneva, argues that the good performance of the southern countries during the crisis has been largely due to favorable external factors. External factors being commodity price increases, increase in capital flows. However, it can also be argued that developing countries learn and internalize the lesson from their previous experiences with global crisis. They improved their macroeconomic management of the economy markedly, paid close attention to the current account balance, and accumulated reserves so as to be in a position to run countercyclical monetary and fiscal policy during times of crisis. In the most recent period, there has been a reduction in growth rates in most middle-income countries as well as in advanced countries. China's growth rate has fallen from 12.7% to 7.9% between 2006 and 2012. Brazil's rate has fallen from 4% in 2006 to 2% in 2012. The fall in the Indian growth rate, which has been much criticized at both home and abroad, has nevertheless not been any greater than in other BRICS. However, the changes in growth rates in rich countries because of their economic downturn has been even more negative. The average growth rate recorded for the period 2006 to 2012 ranged from 0.47% for Japan, 1.06% for US, 0.4% for UK, 1.51% for Germany. These are quite miserable growth rates. The much decried Indian growth rate of 5.9% for the same period of 2006 to 2012 looks quite healthy in comparison. However, this necessary correction to the public perception of Indian economic decline is not to encourage complacency. Rather, it is to agree with much recent research that neither India nor China, nor India-China together, can be the locomotives to pull the world economy out of its post-2007 economic decline. This task can only be done by the US and Eurozone economies when they manage to lift themselves out of their current malaise. We take up now the epic story of South Korean industrialization. In 1960, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world with a per capita income of about $100. Its economic prospects were regarded as being so unpromising that the United States Congress recommended that the country should be given humanitarian aid rather than normal foreign aid for economic development. However, in a mere 30 years, the country catapulted into the ranks of OECD countries, and within the space of 50 years, it has achieved a per capita income of $20,000, from $100 per capita to $20,000. Unfortunately, until 1990, economic history scholarship for East Asian countries was dominated by neoclassical ideas endorsed by the Bretton Woods institutions. The conventional wisdom was that the South Korean government did not intervene much in the economy. Professor Bela Blasa best summed up the analysis of the neoclassical school as well as that of the Bretton Woods institutions in the following terms. The above remarks, he said, are not meant to deny the rise of the role of government in the economic life of East Asia. But apart from the promotion of shipbuilding and steel in Korea and a few strategic industries in Taiwan, the principal contribution of government in the Far East and NICS has been to create a modern infrastructure to provide a stable incentive system and to ensure that government bureaucracy will help rather than hinder exports. It's a widely regarded seminal contribution, Professor Ellis Amston illustrated with chapter and verse the deep involvement of the South Korean government in all aspects of the country's economy to good effect. The government took a leading role in economic development as befitted a developmental state. It presided over a regime of subsidies, taxation, and industrial policy to increase the rate of investment, boost exports, and achieve planned industrialization. Subsidies or special concessions were given to entrepreneurs and firms if they fulfilled the performance targets set by the government. Often these were export targets involving new products which were subject to huge uncertainty whether or not they would succeed. However, the firms produced them because they knew if they followed the government edicts, they would be rescued by the government. Thus, in the words of the World Bank, the entrepreneurial risk was socialized. Despite all the shortcomings of the neoclassical version of the economic history of East Asia, the World Bank nevertheless insisted that developing countries should follow orthodox policies. They should seek and follow their comparative advantage to get the prices right and to have liberalized markets as far as possible. Students of Korean economic history have had great difficulty in dealing with the question of labor rights, the labor movement, and labor markets during the South Korean industrialization. It is widely alleged that in the Korean industrialization drive, human rights were ignored and labor was prevented from organizing collective action. The weaknesses of the trade unions The weaknesses of the trade unions hindered the progress of democracy in the country. Political repression was at times violent. Scholars of the South Korean economy, such as Ellis Amston, were criticized for supporting the regime through their writings, which painted a very favorable picture of South Korean industrialization. Amston's response was that she strongly supported the struggle for democratization in Korea, and specifically, she supported students who took a highly active part in the fight for a democratic political order. The transition to democracy has continued to evolve, and today one can agree with Professor Amston that South Korean people can not only take pride in their huge technological and economic advances, but also in their democratic regime. It is arguable that without this vast industrialization and the creation of a working class, democracy may have taken much longer to evolve in Korea. It was argued earlier in the paper that middle-income countries are faced with a tough agenda if they are to be successful in continuing with their fast industrialization. The collapse of the Eurozone and slow growth in the US makes it much more difficult for developing countries to maintain their growth rates. In this context, Danny Roderick of Harvard University makes an important point in the following terms. One of the paradoxes of the last 2 decades of globalization is that its biggest beneficiaries have been those countries that have flouted its rules, countries like China and India that have effectively played the game by Bretton Woods rather than post-1990s rules, controlled price finance, controlled currencies, industrial policies, significant domestic maneuvering. But as such countries become big players and turn into targets for emulation, the tension becomes too serious to ignore. How we handle these tensions will determine not only the future of convergence, but the future of the world economy itself. The Republic of Korea did not follow a policy of maximum domestic competition or unfettered market determined entry or exit of firms. The government in that country, if anything, went one step further than the Japanese in actively helping to create large conglomerates, promoting mergers, and directing entry and exit of firms according to the requirements of technological scale economies and world demand conditions. The result is that the manufacturing industry of the Republic of Korea displays one of the highest levels of market concentration anywhere, whether among the developed or developing countries. The top 50 Shibboleth account for 15% of the country's GDP in 1990. Among the largest 500 industrial companies in the world in that year, there were 11 Korean firms, a number as high as that of Switzerland. The UN observed, in relation to the Korean industrial structure, such a structure is the deliberate creation of the government, which utilized a highly interventionist industry to push industry into large-scale, complex, technologically demanding activities, while simultaneously restricting FDI inflows tightly to promote national ownership. It is interesting to observe that in the case of Japan, the Korean government did not encourage multinational investment. I mean, a great deal of stress is laid on multinational investment, but neither Korea nor Japan put much stress on it. An important argument of the orthodox thinking is the suggestion that most LDCs lack the institutional capacity to implement the state-directed industrialization, such as in Japan or Korea. The argument is plausible, but not valid, not necessarily valid. The important point to note here is that the Japanese model was itself imitated by Korea and Taiwan. When Korea decided to embark on the Japanese model of in the 1960s, World Bank economists themselves admit Korea did not have the necessary institutional capacity. The bureaucracy of Korea suffered at that time from a lack of skills and deficit of competition ethos, as was indeed the case with Kuomintang bureaucracy in Taiwan. Yet these countries were able to create the right kind of bureaucratic structure and other institutions necessary for implementing the Japanese model. If these institutions could be created by Korea and Taiwan, and later on by Malaysia or Indonesia, surely it must be possible to establish them in many middle-income countries as well, other middle-income countries as well. A fundamental argument of this presentation is that developing countries have much to learn from each other. There should therefore be South-South cooperation and collective learning on developing countries' own experiences. The scope for such learning and its potential benefits are enormous. Several models are available and can be useful. There are a variety of methods of achieving cooperation between the middle-income countries involving education, science, and technology, which can also contribute greatly to mutually beneficial cooperation and exchange. I end this brief presentation by noting an extremely important point, that the South-North cooperation is not intended to replace North-South cooperation, but rather to supplement it with other useful types of collaboration. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Singh. I think I speak for the whole audience when I say that we've all been very inspired listening to you speak. So thank you very much for sharing your insights and views on this. So I'll hand over now to our second speaker, who is Professor Andy McKay, Professor of Development Economics at the University of Sussex. Professor McKay has worked extensively on issues of poverty, inequality, and how these are impacted by policy, i.e. trade policy, fiscal policy, etc. He specializes predominantly in Africa, especially East and West Africa. He has extensive experience of giving policy advice to bilateral donors, including DFID, the international organizations, and governments of developing countries. He was Associate Director of the Chronic Poverty Research Center, which is funded by DFID, and he's also involved with the African Economic Research Consortium and serves on the steering committee of a collaborative research project on growth poverty reduction linkages in Africa. So suitably, his talk today will focus on the growth and living conditions in Africa. So Professor McKay.
Thank you very much to the Marshall Society for the honor of inviting me to speak at this conference. More years ago than I care to remember, I was once a member of the Marshall Society. In my day, we had many good speakers. We didn't do anything of this sort of innovation and initiative. Congratulations to the Marshall Society for this event. This is a really good thing, and hopefully you will have similar events in future. Well done. Pleased to come and contribute. I'm going to talk about Africa. I'm going to talk about the situation in Africa in the last 20 years or so. It's actually, again, very insightful of the committee, the organizing committee, to put myself and Professor Singh in the same session, because we're going to be talking about similar things. I'm going to be talking more in a low-income country context, but some of the points are similar. I'm not going to do the careful analysis of a particular country, as Professor Singh has just presented. I want to just do a survey of the situation in Africa. I want to talk to you about growth. I want to talk to you about growth, first of all, going way back to independence. Professor Singh also talked about Korea over 50 years. I want to look at some of the recent story. I've basically been working in Africa for about 25 years. When I started working in Africa, this was seen as a basket case. This was seen as the failure of development. This was seen as a continent where nothing good was happening. Now we hear talk about African Renaissance, about how well Africa is doing. Neither of those stories was quite right. At least both of those stories were much more a simplification of the reality. But something has changed. In the 25 years I've been working in Africa, something has changed. So I'm going to talk about what's happened to growth, then about living conditions. Growth is all very well. What we care about is the conditions in which people live. What are some of the underlying factors? And then I want to talk a little bit forward-looking. That is constant US dollar GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa over 50 years. And basically what we see is different periods. The first thing to notice is the first 15 years after independence is actually quite impressive. quite good growth performance. Ambitious governments really wanting to do well for the country, quite good levels of growth were achieved. The following 20 years, from about the mid-70s, early 70s to early 90s, was the development disaster. We see declining negative growth. Some of this was about unsustainable policies from the past. Some of this was about, referring to this morning's presentation, poor management of resource wealth. This is also the period of structural adjustment, again referred to in the morning, where countries were imposed very harsh conditions. We can see the consequence for growth, but we can also see a recovery. We can also see a recovery to a higher level than African countries have ever achieved from about the early to mid-90s onwards. It's particularly fast in the last 10 years, but it's a significant change. I want to focus more on that recent period. That's the chart for the last 15 years. That makes it look quite small. But that's a 30% increase over 15 years. And this is in per capita GDP. And this is in a region where there's fast population growth. And this is including some countries that have had disastrous development performance. This is including Zimbabwe. This is including Democratic Republic of Congo, which performed very poorly over much of this period, and many others. The Economist has been one of the people to pick up and publicize the success of African growth. This quote from about 2012, 6 of the 10 fastest growing countries in the world over the 10 years up to 2010 were in sub-Saharan Africa. In the following 5 years, they predict 7 will be in Africa. Note even Congo is among those 7 in the 2011 to 15 period. The chart on the left there shows African GDP in dark blue even overtaking Asian GDP growth in light blue towards the end of the period. This is significant. Stephen Radley, co-author of one of the development textbooks that some of you might use with USAID, wrote this book on emerging Africa. And basically, he is looking at the success. He talks about how 17 countries in Africa are leading the way. 13 countries have emerged, 4 others were ready to emerge. That was his map of Africa. The blue ones there, the blue countries there, are the ones that have achieved, that he reckons have emerged. The green ones are the ones that he reckons are ready to emerge. Oil producers are not included there. Oil producers are the ones in grey. He is not identifying those as among the emerging or ready to emerge countries. The oil producers are a little bit of a different case. The Economist is a similar map, about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. Darker colours there represent better growth performance. There they don't care about whether it's oil producers or not, and some of the fastest growing countries there, like Angola, are oil producers. But so is Ethiopia, which is not. But also what one sees from these maps is quite a diversity of performance. There's a lot of well-performing countries. When I started working in Africa, there were 2 or 3 countries that were starting to perform well, that were starting to function well. Now there's quite a lot that are growing well. Now, much is said about the quality of data, in particular the quality of GDP data in Africa. But despite that, anyone that goes to Africa, there's quite a lot of evidence of growth taking place. Where's this growth coming from, and what have been some of the factors? Radley, in his book, identifies a number of things that he thinks are important, and a couple of these points, again, relate back to things we said this morning. One point is about more democratic government and more accountable government. So instead of having a government controlled by a few people in their own self-interest, we have more accountable government. We have better economic policy. We have a much different role for international cooperation, international organizations. We have a new generation of African leaders of business leaders, of activists, and so on, who are more involved and who I think are, and this I think is, these are all, I think, significant factors behind better growth performance. Note what isn't said there. Nothing about commodity prices, nothing about oil producers, nothing about the end of conflict, which has certainly happened over this period. Of course, those things are relevant, and of course, those things happen. But some of the other things are the underlying reasons. Better government and so on, better resource management, some of these things underlie some of these other factors like reduced conflict. There are negative growth cases. We saw that in the map. Zimbabwe, for example, many other examples. We know that there are many incidents of conflict in Africa at the moment. So it's not completely a positive story, but there are a lot of positive stories in growth terms. Growth data is not great, as I say, but I don't think one can deny that growth is happening in a lot of places. Now, okay, growth. Well, what use is growth? What we care about is the conditions in which people live. What we care about is whether people's children can survive to their first birthday or their fifth birthday. What we care about is whether people are educated. What we care about is whether people are able to get out of poverty. Growth may facilitate those things, but actually what we're really interested in are these things. And there's a widely expressed feeling in Africa that people are not feeling growth in their pockets. They keep hearing about this growth, but they don't see it in their own lives. Now, what I think we do have is reasonable data to assess living conditions. Demographic and health surveys have been conducted now across many African countries, broadly comparable at different points in time. We can see changes in, say, infant mortality, under 5 mortality, education outcomes, and so on. So I want to just look quickly, there's lots of charts, but I'm only going to focus on a couple of them, on health and educational and poverty outcomes over the last 20 years or so. We skip over the first 2 slides for the time being. Let's look at this one, which is under 5 mortality rate. Now, basically what we have here is several observations for the same country. The observations for the same country are sort of columns which are grouped together, and there's a little space before we move along to the next country. So we have Mali, we have Mozambique, we have Niger, and so on. Now, in almost all of these cases, although not all of these cases, what one sees is a decline in under 5 mortality rates. Look at Rwanda, for example. Look at Senegal. Mali, the reduction is much more gradual. Look at Zimbabwe in the right, which is not a case of reduction. But most of these cases are reductions in under 5 mortality, quite big reductions over what are 15 or 20-year periods. Now, not to deny that the rates are still very high, and that's for sure. These countries are still very poor. But there has been improvement. Let's look at, quickly, education. Secondary school attendance. Now, secondary school attendance is very low across Africa. But it has increased. And it has increased almost everywhere. So again, we see similar bars for different countries. Ghana, there we see quite big increases. Nigeria, we see quite big increases. Some of the French-speaking countries in West Africa, we see slower increases and quite low levels of attendance. But education rates are getting better. If we look at monetary poverty, that's more difficult to measure. That's more difficult to be sure that we're comparing like for like. In most cases, monetary poverty also is going down. There are some similar figures for monetary poverty. Again, in most cases, the figures are going down, but there are cases where Nigeria, we're not quite sure what's happening because the data are not very consistent. South Africa, there's not much change in that data, but in quite a few cases, there's significant reductions in monetary poverty. In summary, educational outcomes are certainly improving everywhere. There's been huge investment in education. Many more people are going to school. Health outcomes have generally improved in most places. Monetary poverty usually has fallen, not always. But let's just remember, these figures are proportion. This is the proportion of the population. If the population is growing, the absolute number of children that are dying might not be falling. The proportion is, the absolute number might not be. Now, other perspectives are less positive. There was an Afrobarometer survey quite recently which gave a much less positive assessment. And it's certainly true that in some countries, a few people are getting very rich, that's for sure. I think to some extent, expectations change. As people get more educated, as people get a little bit wealthier, people's expectations change. What people want for their children, for their family, changes, quite legitimately so. What are factors behind some of these living conditions improvements? Health and education, well, having more money helps because, yes, your children might need to work less and maybe they can spend more time in school, might lead to better health outcomes, but what probably matters is public spending. Public spending in health and education. Growth gives more revenue for government, yes, but actually the big story here is probably aid. Aid-funded spending in health and education, I think, has had a really big impact. For monetary poverty, that's much more closely associated with growth. So where we have growth, we generally have reduction in monetary poverty, as long as the growth is not very unequal. Okay, health and education are important in their own rights. They are fundamental development outcomes. They're also, though, important for future growth. A healthier, more educated population is also a basis for faster growth. But there's quite a few issues. One issue, and again this was referred to in the case of China this morning, job creation. Job creation is a major challenge in Africa. So many people are educated, but what are these educated people able to do? If there are not jobs available, what are they able to do? Job creation is a major problem. I think it's particularly a problem for young women. Young women leaving school, that transition between school and early labour market entry, I think, is really important for the whole of their lives. And it's also important for things like fertility. That, I think, is a really important issue. I think it's also true to say, yes, there's been growth, yes, there's been poverty reduction. The ability to translate growth into poverty reduction, Africa has not done as well as Asia. Asian countries were more effective at translating growth into poverty reduction. And Asian countries were better at growth. Sorry. Okay. That should have been a chart showing the GDP trajectory of Asia compared to Africa. When you put them on the same axis, going back to 1960, Africa looks almost flat, Asia shoots up. There's a huge difference between East Asia and Africa. And even if one looks in the most recent period, still East Asia is growing faster than Africa. Yeah. Okay. Assessing and looking forward. Democracy is now fairly well established in Africa. We said that was an important factor for growth. It's probably an important factor for better health and educational outcomes as well. But political stability remains a major challenge. Remember the Kenyan election in 2007 and the contested result. Kenya, a relatively affluent country, with these issues. Now, other countries like Ghana have managed two changes of regime in the democratic period. Touch and go at times, but they managed it. But not all countries are necessarily able to manage these transitions. That's critical. There are still lots of political leaders in Africa who've been in power for a very long time. And one has to ask the question, well, what happens after? I mentioned Rwanda and Uganda there. Leaders who've been in power for a very long period of time. What happens next? Is there going to be a political vacuum? There are risks. There are significant risks there. There is certainly continued conflict in Africa. I'm not trying to paint a completely positive picture. The growth story is much more positive. The living standards story, on average, is much more positive. It is not to deny that there are not major challenges and major difficulties, continued conflicts, and that, of course, is a symptom of failure in all kinds of areas, institutional, governance, and everything else. Africa has changed a lot in 20 years, that's for sure. Some of that dates back to older things, but a lot has changed in the last 20 years. That said, the structural transformation of the economies is still fairly limited. Job creation, as I said, is still a major challenge. There are many other issues and difficulties and potential challenges, some referring to the discussion of China this morning. Regional inequality, often growing in many countries. That can often divide along ethnic lines or religious lines. That's a risk. That's a potential risk for political instability. There's potentially the risk of growing inequality. There's potentially the risk of environmental challenges moving forward. Some of those middle-income trap issues might still be issues even in these low-income countries. And it remains the case that African countries are still very poor. So yes, there's been progress, but compare it with East Asia, and it suddenly starts to look less impressive. It's very positive. As I say, I've been working for 25 years in Africa. It's much more positive than at any time I've worked in Africa, but there remain challenges, I think, in sustaining growth, making this growth sustainable, and sharing its benefits more equitably. And that's a challenge for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor McKay. Insightful from lots of stylized facts as well on Africa. We'll go into question and answers now. So any questions from upstairs? Yep.
Both for your talks. A question on Africa. I was wondering, I know that a lot of the improvement in living standards in Africa recently has come from NGOs and religious organizations rather than from government initiatives. I was wondering whether you think that that ever distorts our view on how well governments are actually doing at improving their policies, and whether you think that it gives those governments an excuse to do less if there are NGOs kind of helping and providing things like healthcare, then the government doesn't have such an incentive to do it themselves.
Okay. Going to Professor McKay on Africa.
It's true for sure that there are many NGO initiatives across Africa which are having very positive impacts in terms of providing drinking water, providing healthcare facilities, providing education, and this makes an important impact. Yes, to some extent, NGO activity, governments might feel that that absolves some of the responsibilities. I think NGO activity doesn't necessarily reach the whole country. It tends to reach particular areas of the country. I think government responsibility to provide these facilities still remains the case. NGOs have certainly been a significant part of the improvement, but I don't think that's just the story. I think it is about government provided as well. Now, the measures I sort of showed were, for example, about enrollment in secondary school. Well, what does that mean? I mean, if the secondary school isn't teaching anything useful, what's the value of that? So we also have to ask questions about the quality. So I think the question in relation to government, I think, is about the delivery of services. Is it reaching poorest areas? And about the quality. And I think those are the challenges. NGOs fill in some areas, but I don't think NGOs, in most countries, NGOs don't cover the whole country.
Yeah, one more up there.
Thank you very much. I've got two questions. Professor, what do you think about idea of creating transnational bank for BRICS countries, which would have to implement Beijing consensus? And second question about Africa. What was the role of microfinance in reducing the monetary poverty in Africa? Thank you very much once again.
Transnational banks in BRICS countries.
Well, international banks do their normal jobs anywhere they go. They're not necessarily a panacea for all things which are wrong. International banks can make a small contribution to economic growth, not a large contribution. That has to be done by the people themselves. On Africa, my own view is that the African countries have made huge progress in the last 25 years. When Africa became independent, Tanzania, for example, in 1964, had only 7 university graduates who were black. Now, you go anywhere in Africa, there are research institutes, business schools, engineering schools. The whole continent is being prepared for life in the modern world. It may take 50 years, but it will be on the right track. What one has to avoid is Idi Amin and his colleagues. The educational system which the Africans inherited from the British was worth preserving, but it didn't happen. But now is the time to learn from these mistakes and to concentrate on engineering, business, and ways of earning a living. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor McKay.
Yeah, I think many things are behind poverty reduction in Africa where it's happened. Part of it is agriculture, where agriculture has functioned well. Think of Ethiopia, think of Malawi, for example. Credit may be part of the story, but I think other things are much more important in relation to agriculture. Rwanda is another example. Certainly non-agricultural growth of non-agricultural activities has also been important, and as African countries are going to grow and develop, they're going to have to become less and less reliant on agriculture and diversify more into non-agricultural activities. Microfinance can play a role in helping people to do that. It's much less developed than, for example, in Bangladesh, but it's starting to happen more across Africa, maybe especially in East Africa. I think it's a small factor. It's a factor, but I think it's a small one.
Another question over there.
Thanks very much for your two talks. This is a question for Professor McKay, and it was touched briefly upon this morning in the Chinese ambassador's talk. He talked about how China's helping the world, and obviously your talk there was about Africa. So to what extent do you think China has been behind some of Africa's recent better growth performance? And do you think this is causing any resentment within Africa? Thank you.
Okay, two questions really there. Is it causing resentment? Yes, in some cases it is causing resentment. I mean, China's been doing many different things. One thing is it's been investing a lot in infrastructure. Now that I think is a positive. I think that is a positive thing. One can maybe talk about the quality of the infrastructure that's created, but building roads and so on, these things I think have quite important development impacts. Obviously, some of China's other interventions in Africa have different motivations. So investing in natural resource-related activities and so on is that I think we don't know. I think we don't know enough to be able to judge the beneficial impacts of that or not yet. There is some resentment. I mean, Chinese investors using all their own labor instead of using African laborers, for example. There are points of resentment, but on the other hand, a number of African countries are very happy to deal with a different type of donor to what they've been used to from Europe and North America. So I think it's a mixed story, and I think it's an emerging story.
Great, thank you. Do you have comments on China in Africa?
Well, the Chinese are supposed to have their own interests versus African countries. I don't think anything the Chinese are doing in Africa is necessarily harmful to Africa. They're providing the main markets for African exports, and they have normally been supportive of the regime in case of development. I think a lot of what is said about Chinese role, which is not good for Africa, turns out on inspection to be not very good. I think this is a general question of exchange of population. I mean, the world is very unequally distributed. There are many countries which could expand productivity by having more labor. There are other countries which could diminish labor and have more productivity. I would much rather lay emphasis on the training of labor forces in different countries.
And you believe China is adding to that?
Yeah. I mean, the increased interchange of students and labor forces between countries is very essential for good development. And I think for our generation, it's the emphasis on education and training, which is what will pay in the end. So I don't think the Chinese intervention in Africa should be regarded as sinister. It's no more than what the world has been doing for the last 400 years. So,
yeah, thank you very much. I think that leaves us with one last question. Is that okay? Great. So this gentleman over there.
Thank you. This is for Andy McKay, is that right? So a lot of evidence shows that African countries are not achieving the same rates of investment, especially in infrastructure, manufacturing value added across the economy, and export sophistication and diversification as many of the successful growth stories post-World War II, when they were in fact at the same income levels as many African countries are now. Doesn't this give support that in fact Africa's growth is not showing signs that it's going to be sustainable? And shouldn't this point to the fact that African countries must learn more from the successful historic cases of long-term sustainable growth? Thank you.
1 minute answer.
Okay, 1 minute answer. Certainly African countries can learn a lot more from other experiences of other regions of the world. I mean, one has to recognize, though, that different countries have different types of resource endowments, and in particular, labor and capital. So the situation is a bit different, I think, to Asian countries. But it's certainly true that African countries have not really succeeded in making structural transformation, and have not, with a few exceptions, really broken into manufacturing or services. Now, it may not be manufacturing that matters these days, it may be other things, but even moving into processing primary products and stuff like that, they haven't really made very much progress in those fields either, rather. So I think I think there's an awful lot of work to do. I don't think I think it's perfectly possible for them to make progress, but it might not be exactly the same as what some of the East Asian countries have done before.
Okay, great. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all the questions from the floor. If you join me in thanking our speakers one more time.